Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of those shows at filmseizure.com. This week I have two fantastic movies to discuss. One from my favorite living director, Guillermo del Toro, somebody who often shows up on my Monster Mondays program, and one featuring one of my all-time favorite superheroes, Spider-Man. I begin with talking about the new Guillermo del Toro picture, Nightmare Alley. Nightmare Alley is the second adaptation of the 1946 William Lindsay Gresham novel about a gifted con man and the depths that he'd go to continue to manipulate potential marks, and it ultimately leading him to believe his own act as truth and gospel to disastrous ends. The first film version was made just 1 year later, starring Tyrone Power. Power was quite good as the lead, Stanton Carlyle. Co-starring was the lovely Colleen Gray as Molly. The main critique that I would have about the 1947 film is how much smarter and knowing the Molly character was. In the novel, Molly was a little bit more of a simpler girl with a detailed backstory and history that included her loving memories of a father, not too unlike Stanton, but the simple fact that no one could really compare to him either. That's all missing from the film. Also missing is the more seedier elements of Stanton's personality. His manipulation of his mentor Xena, played in the 1947 film by the marvelous Joan Blondell. And he was able to do that through sex and his cruelty towards Molly. All of that stuff is missing. So when it comes to Del Toro's version, starring Bradley Cooper as Stanton, Toni Collette as Xena, and Rooney Mara as Molly, I was hoping that the seediness and cruelty that is such an important part of the novel would return. It's a big part as to why it's really kind of considered today to be an American classic, about how the sleazy inhabitants of traveling showbiz and all of its lowest forms of that to achieve riches and fame. So this movie succeeds in bringing that sleaze back with a slight twist here and there on the original source material. Like any adaptation, the most important thing is to bring forward the essence that makes the story and the characters within interesting and engaging, and that is something that this movie does in spades. Cooper Stan is a redeemable character at the beginning of the movie. At least you feel that he could be. As success gets to him, he crumbles under that weight. This movie does a good job of and really kind of showing this Stanton being led by the nose toward that kind of forbidden fruit of riches. You get a good look at the beginning of Stanton likely having done a bad thing, but he lays low until these kindly but maybe unseemly carnies take him in, and he starts to separate himself from the rest of the world and sees himself as something better, meant for something more. And this starts us down a winding road that makes you ask yourself if what Stanton starts to do with Toni Collette and David Strathairn and Rooney Mara is honest and coming from a good place, or if he's using them to get to that next rung. There is a very specific moment in this movie where things really kind of begin to fall apart for Stanton, and it centers around when Stanton starts to take on extra side hustles. In particular, he commits the cardinal sin in the world of the carny and begins performing what are unaffectionately called spook shows. This is when a mentalist, which is what Stanton Carlyle specializes in, begins to offer up what are apparently readings for people who've lost a loved one. It's basically the lowest form of huckstery, as I like to call it at least. This is where you question what's the difference between someone selling you the bullshit to make you feel better about that loss that you're feeling versus what maybe preachers might sell to people on Sunday to their parishioners. We obviously know the difference, but can we trust people who, within reason, basically cheat their audiences for a few bucks every day to know that difference? There are connections that you can draw from one deadly sin in this movie to the next. People who covet things, or lusted, or were greedy, or handle things with anger, or in revenge in some cases. They're all represented here in different ways, but usually based on past regrets that are then taken advantage of by someone with his own regrets. But this comes at you with multiple cautionary tales to avoid, but only a few of the characters are actually smart and careful enough to know when they have reached the line they cannot cross. In some ways, this movie is sad and bleak, with only maybe one sole character in this whole story who is at least more innocent than the others. But damn it, you are hanging on every moment. You are watching Bradley Cooper and Rooney Mara every time they're on screen. Mara in particular has to downplay much of her frustration and anger in the second and third acts of this movie. When Cate Blanchett comes into the film, she slinks around like a true femme fatale vixen that is just as seductive as can be for someone you are uncomfortably watching. She's a snake in Stanton's Garden of Eden, and there isn't a moment she doesn't ooze some sort of energy that makes you either want to sink into her therapist couch or run as far away from her as possible. Oftentimes you're doing that at the same time. This is a wonderfully designed movie. The moment you heard that Guillermo del Toro was going to do a movie that would feature a large portion of the film at a carnival, you knew it would be a perfect match. It's also very well acted. Aside from the very strong possibility that this film would be nominated for a production design Oscar, there are at least 4 or 5 people in this film who could conceivably nominated for an acting Oscar. But I would definitely expect Bradley Cooper to get a nod for Best Actor in a Leading Role. He is doing the act on you during the film. He's capturing your attention with every moment that he is on screen and within sight. Without a doubt, after spending 15 plus hours recently with the subject matter of Nightmare Alley, between listening to the audiobook, watching that 1947 film, and now seeing the new film, I am extremely satisfied. This will be, without a doubt, among the top films of the year for me. Okay, so now let's move on to the second movie of this double feature review, Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, while this is the 4th film in 2021 from Marvel Studios, it's really the first to have that large-scale Marvel feel. There is a little bit of this kind of through line so far in these 4 movies that have come out, whereas Black Widow has a much more personal story. Shang-Chi was personal, but seemed to be kind of pointing to the future of the Marvel Universe. And Eternals was a little different, telling a big-scale superhero story, but from a kind of a different perspective that, at least in my opinion, made an attempt at a familial feel. Now, Spider-Man, well, that's a little bit of a different story, but it also gets a little personal. But we do expect big things from Peter Parker. In this 3rd film of the Marvel Cinematic Universe for Spidey, he's not only joined by his usual supporting cast, he's also joined by a heavy hitter character who happens to be next up with his own sequel in 2022, Doctor Strange. But Peter's also joined by an all-star cast of villains from the past 2 Spider-Man film series in Marvel's attempt to push storytelling into a more multiversal space. And if you're at all confused by what I just said, well, that's the multiverse for you. But at the conclusion of the previous Spider-Man film, Far From Home, J. Jonah Jameson, the dastardly headline-slanting head of the Daily Bugle, revealed that Peter Parker was indeed Spider-Man. While that part was true, trying to frame Peter for the death of the villain Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, well, that used some doctored footage created by Mysterio himself to incriminate Peter as a murderer. Now everyone knows who Spider-Man is and thinks of him as the guy who killed Quentin Beck. Thus, this throws the teenage superhero's life into turmoil that he now needs the help of the Sorcerer Supreme, Doctor Strange, to fix. However, what we get in this movie is not the assumed Peter needs Doctor Strange to fix this for his own life to become a little less crazy plot that you might expect. This really turns into a little bit more of an altruistic and very Peter Parker concept of really wanting to fix things so that his girlfriend MJ and his best friend Ned can get into MIT. Their close association with Spider-Man is immediately revealed as well in the early moments of this movie. So right from the start, you see Peter be maybe a little bit more of his comic book counterpart than you kind of expect to see. He's shouldering a lot of this blame, whether it really is his to shoulder or not, and he's legitimately trying to fix it. But what happens is that Peter's own desires interferes with the good doctor's spell to kind of reverse everybody knowing who he is. And it opens up these portals, basically, in which everyone in the multiverse who knows that a certain Peter Parker is indeed their universe's version of Spider-Man, well, these people start coming through into the MCU's universe. So all these villains start to kind of pour out. And it's really kind of a clever idea. It's not just bringing these people over. It's bringing them over because they know Peter Parker is Spider-Man, even if Tom Holland isn't their universe's Peter Parker. What's more clever and really more brilliant than anything is how big this movie ends up becoming. It's got a cast of so many characters from so many different corners of the Spider-Man franchises for the past 19 years. It balances that really well with, again, that smaller personal Peter Parker story that he learns that he can't always do right no matter how hard he tries to make things right. And it really leads to the second half of the movie being extremely heartfelt and very emotional. I really can't go into much without starting to reveal spoilers for this movie, and it's really a good idea for you to avoid spoilers as best you can. But from what we do know in the trailers alone, I can definitely say that Tom Holland is so at home as Peter Parker. He carries this film in so many ways, despite his huge supporting cast being so present and ultimately having larger roles in this movie. He still has this earnestness as this idealistic kid who's trying to embody that idea that with great power must also come great responsibility. It creates this different side to the wall crawler that we didn't see at this kind of level in either the Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield runs. Two villains in particular, Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, and Alfred Molina as Dr. Octopus, they really kind of slip right back into their roles from almost 2 full decades ago now in kind of seamless fashion. It's really like they kind of have been playing these roles continuously over the last 2 decades. Not one moment did I think that they were off. Not 1 second did I think that they were, that I didn't think that they were the same guys from Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2. It brought back a lot of great memories of those 2 great movies. Overall, this feels like a fully lived in and fleshed out Marvel universe. We see interactions you'd not quite expect that makes this feel like comic books with interacting characters within a truly shared universe. This is a top-tier Marvel Cinematic Universe entry and easily among the very best Spider-Man movies that maybe could ever be made. Even though the news of a trio of additional Spider-Man movies would be co-produced between Marvel and Sony Pictures came out just before the release of this movie, there is a real feeling of closure to this current trilogy. The series can now take a new direction and not have to worry about what happened in these 3 films that have come out already. It was incredibly satisfying, and I had the same feelings at the end of this movie that I had at the end of Avengers Endgame. This is a chapter closing, but it's not the end. If I could give one criticism that knocks this movie just below the top 5 of the MCU films to date, it would probably be that the first half of this movie feels a little underwhelming. But it does serve to set up an amazingly impactful and emotional second half that delivers in ways a Spider-Man film rarely does. So to sum up SpiderMan No Way Home, this is truly a Spider-Man movie for the ages. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so that you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. And you can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. Now, I'll be back next week with a review of the new Paul Thomas Anderson coming-of-age drama Licorice Pizza. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.